to join us for this webinar. To provide some background, Professor Vollrath is a professor and chair of the economics department at the University of Houston. He is also past recipient of the Rossland Teaching Award. He has written extensively about his special research interest, economic growth, having been featured in the Journal of Development Economics and other publications he has published. He runs his own economic, which we link later at. Moreover, he has also worked on why is a sign of success. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Vollrath.
Can you guys hear me now? We're good? Okay, excellent. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you guys for having me. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here to grab some slides that will just help me show you guys some stuff that is easier than me talking. Okay, so as Joel said, so I'm interested in economic growth in general. Generally kind of long run economic growth, and one of the topics and one of the ideas that has been on my mind a lot lately is about the slower economic growth that the US and pretty much all developed kind of Western economies, Japan, even Korea, a lot of kind of relatively rich economies have experienced recently. And as the kind of the tagline that probably got sent out for this talk, and as you'll see on the slide, what I want to talk to you guys about is why that slowdown occurred and why you might want to actually see that maybe not as a good thing, but as something that is a consequence of successes in the past. So it's maybe not something that we'd want to have go away. So here's just the in crude detail, like the slowdown that I'm talking about. So during the 20th century, the growth rate of GDP per capita was about 2.25% per year. And in the 21st century, literally from the year 2000 until now, the last 20 years, it's been about 1% per capita. So less than half of the rate during the 20th century. And just to be clear, right, this slower growth doesn't mean that GDP per capita hasn't gone up. It's going up, it's just not going up very fast. Right, and so the question is well, why, right? Like, why did this happen? What are the reasons for it, and how should we interpret those in our outlook for how important this is as something we should fix, right? So I think this fact kind of gets people freaked out. It's like, we have to do something. We have to do something. And in some sense, what I'm going to tell you is that there maybe isn't much to do about this. And that in some sense, that will free us up to think about lots of other things that maybe we want to do. So the way to think about it, and this is kind of the big idea for thinking about this growth slowdown, is you want to think about asking yourself, okay, so let's say this is a bad thing, and ask yourself, well, what would you do to fix it? What would you give up, right? What would you sacrifice? This is I'm an economics professor. I like the idea of opportunity costs. I like the idea of thinking about trade-offs. And so the question is not, what do you do to raise growth? The question is, what would you give up in order to have faster growth? What I'm going to tell you over the course of the rest of the slides, and what I'll give you the quick preview now, is that I don't believe that any of you would be willing to give up the things that got us this slow growth rate. And in short, those things are going to be high material living standards, having access to lots of goods, and fundamental changes in people's ability to determine their own family size and kind of age and marriage and stuff. There's a lot of demographics involved. And ultimately, these are things that people fought for and people worked hard at, and it's not obvious that we want to get rid of them. And so therefore, it's not obvious we want to get rid of slow growth. Okay. All right. So hence the reason that I like to call this growth slowdown a consequence of success. And the two successes that I just started to mention that are behind this are the demographics and a shift away from producing things and into producing services. Okay? So these are going to be the two big drivers of the slower growth that you guys are essentially have lived through and will experience into your near future, and that I kind of witnessed growing up at a time of high growth and shifting into slow growth. So the big shifts that occurred kind of during my lifetime are the demographic shift, aging population, and the shift into services. Before I go on and explain to you or talk about the sources of all this and my interpretation of it, I want to be really careful and leave you guys to keep this in mind, which is that when I'm going to keep saying these are the consequences of success, and slow growth is an outcome of us being a rich country and having expanded rights and things like that. And I want to be clear that when I say success, I don't mean perfection. I don't mean that the argument here is not that you should believe that the economy or society has kind of got it all figured out and that there's nothing to complain about. I think, so I wrote this book before the pandemic. It came out before the pandemic, so quite clearly the world has a lot of imperfections in it. And the argument here is not that things are perfect. In fact, when I keep talking about it, I'll suggest to you that the idea that growth is slow, in fact, frees us to think about all the other things that are kind of imperfect about our economy. And that this is one of the reasons that it's a success, or to be thought about as a success. All right, so boring math bits. There's boring math bits all over the book and all over the kind of work I do, but the boring math bits are where you get to this story. So in the 20th century, the growth rate of GDP per capita was 2.25%, like I had said. And that you can break that down into different sources, and physical capital accumulation, like building new buildings, buying bulldozers, purchasing laptops, that kind of stuff. It can come from human capital, which is having more workers relative to the population, having workers that go to college and get trained and all that kind of good stuff. Or it can come from productivity, which is kind of this disembodied ability to produce more with less, right? It's technology, it's also efficiency, it's management, it's all that kind of stuff. So in the 20th century, physical capital actually was negative for growth. We accumulated a lot of capital, but not very fast, as it turns out. The two big drivers of growth in the 20th century were human capital and productivity. And those numbers, the 0.96 and the 1.51, don't mean a whole lot by themselves. They mean a lot when you look at the second line, at the 21st century, where we have slow growth. And there you can see the physical capital difference isn't very much. It's still negative, and it's pretty close to what it was in the 20th century. The big change, the big change, is this human capital number. It used to contribute 0.96% per year, or almost a 1% growth rate just from human capital. And now it's a minus 0.15 drag. So the vast majority of the growth slowdown that you guys are living through relative to the 20th century is because human capital grows more slowly than it used to. And I'll get into why that is. Productivity growth has also dropped, and there are different ways you can measure this stuff, and you can make productivity a little more important or human capital a little less important, but the general story is always about this. Okay? So human capital and productivity, those are the two things that are driving the slower growth. Both of those rates fell. Okay, so let's focus on the demographic side, the human capital bits. This figure gives you the age distribution of the US population in 3 different years. So the bottom line, the dark heavy line, is 1960. The middle line is 1990, and then the top line's basically this year. It was a projection of this year from about a year ago, so it's basically accurate. So what you can see in 1960, right? So the curves move up over time, which just means there's getting more and more people. There's more and more people in the U.S. But I want you to focus on like the distribution of the line across the ages. So down the x-axis are age bins. So how many people are in each 5-year group? So how many people are 0 to 4 years old? How many people are 5 to 9? How many people are 60 to 64? You can see in 1960, it slopes down hard, right? So there's tons of little kids. This is the heart of the baby boom. So there's lots of 0 to 4-year-olds. There's lots of 5 to 9-year-olds. There's a big hole around 20 to 24-year-olds. Those are people that were lost in World War II. But in general, there's lots of young people and very few old people, right? In fact, those people are so young, they aren't even part of the workforce in 1960, right? These are kids in grade school. This is essentially it's not quite my mom, but it's my mom, right? So my mom would have been about 14 years old in 1960. So she's down, up in that left-hand side. Now, by 1990, what happens? Well, everybody gets older, right? And so that bulge of kids in 1960 is now a bulge of 20 to 30-year-olds, right? And so the big peak in the middle, around 30 years old in 1990, that's the baby boomers and the tail end of the baby boom being right in the heart of the workforce. And it still tails down. There aren't very many old people. There are more old people than there were in 1960, but the big chunk of the population is in the heart of their working age in 1990. Now, what happens by 2020? Well, the curves have shifted up, but notice where the bulge of the baby boomers is gone. Now they're 50 to 65, 55 to 65. Right? And we still have lots of kids, right? There's more 0 to 4-year-olds today than there were in 1960. But notice how flat that dotted line at the top is. Right? We've got lots of old people for all of the young people. Right? And this is going to be a ton of the story about why growth is slow today. So let's break down this human capital growth. So I told you that human capital growth was 0.96% in the 20th century and minus 0.15 now. So that was accounting for a lot of the drop. In the 20th century, where did that big growth rate in human capital come from? Well, a lot of it came from education, increasing education rates. So again, that baby boom generation, the post-World War II group, goes essentially as the first generation of people to go to have widespread college attainment, right? So my grandmother didn't go to college. None of my grandparents went to college. All of my aunts and uncles went to college, essentially, minus 1 or 2, right? And then my generation, essentially everybody went to college, and my kids are presumably going to go to college if they don't want to make me mad. So, you know, the education experience of the United States increased a lot in the 20th century. The experience part is just that people kind of get better at their jobs as they age until that kind of levels off right at about almost exactly as old as I am right now. And then they don't get much better at it anymore. In fact, they might start to get worse, which is depressing. But the economy had an increasing number of people entering and getting older. And so they were hitting their prime working age. They were getting really good. They're really productive. They're really smart. They're working hard. And the most important part here is that the fraction of workers to the number of people was increasing. All those kids from the baby boom were entering the workforce. So now, rather than having tons of little kids at home who, as much as I love my kids, they don't contribute crap to the economy, right? They're just a time suck on me. Once kids enter the workforce, they become a productive member of the workforce. So a big chunk of economic growth in the 20th century was just because we were adding lots of workers. And the last little bit here is just that hours per week have been declining in the long run. You know, people in the 1800s used to work 80 hours a week, and by the middle of the 20th century, people worked a lot of 40 to 50-hour weeks, and now it's probably 30 to 40. Now compare what's going on to the 21st century, and you see education accumulation has dipped. What's going on there? It's that we've kind of flatlined. Like most people, like the college attainment rates have flatlined. High school, pretty much everybody graduates from high school, and the percent of people that go to college is kind of flatlined. And so that isn't contributing as much. Experience actually contributes a little more. You got the baby boomers are still in the workforce. People like me are coming up behind them, are still adding the experience. But the thing that's really happening here is that the workers to population is falling. And that's all these old people who were little kids in the 20th century and then workers. What happened to them? Well, they started to retire. They got old, and now they're leaving the workforce. Okay, and this has a huge drag on the contribution of human capital, right? We're shedding all these workers. And because they didn't have kids at nearly the rate that their parents did, we're getting an aging population with fewer workers for every person. Okay. So this is really going to be the story here. Workers to population and workers to population. We used to have big growth in that, and now we have a negative growth in that. Okay. So where did this come from? Why did this demographic shift happen? Three reasons. Okay. Higher living standards, contraceptives, and women's labor force participation. Okay. So in the middle of the 20th century, the baby boom is happening, and people are having families that are 3 kids, 4 kids, 5 kids. So, my mom is one of 4, my dad is one of 4, big families, and they were even bigger in the 30s and the 20s, right? We had lots of big families. So what do we know from a lot of sociological, economic, psychological, across disciplines? What do we know about living standards and family size? Is that they're negatively related. As people get rich, people have smaller families, right? And there's a bunch of interesting theories about why that is, but a lot of the prominent ones are just that really kind of come in 2 flavors. One is that as people kind of get richer, and so your wage goes up, the time cost of taking care of kids is pretty high, right? I could be out working, I could be advancing my career, or I could be essentially staying home or sacrificing that time to take care of kids. And so as living standards get higher, that's actually a bigger sacrifice to make. And the other one is that as living standards go up, in some sense, the complexity and the education that kids need in order to just participate in the economy is so much higher that parents need to expend a lot of efforts on a few kids. Like, I need to get my 2 kids into college as opposed to having 5 of them, and maybe 1 or 2 of them will go to college. Right? So high living standards, we see this across time. We see this across countries. As people get richer, they have smaller families. And so that's what we started to see in the middle of the 20th century. My mom was one of 4. My dad was one of 4. But they got married, they had 2 kids. Okay? All my aunts and uncles, to the extent that they had kids, had small families. Right? Why? Well, they're busy. They had careers. They had professions. This is kind of what happens in the late 20th century. We have fewer kids because living standards have gone up. But the family sizes and fertility rates also fell because women finally had access to on-demand, self-regulated contraception. Right? So prior to the pill being introduced in the early 60s, right, there was no real effective contraceptive technique, like, with a success rate in the 90% that was wholly reliant on women's control over their own fertility. Right, other contraception available at the time required, in some sense, cooperation. Right, you needed a man's cooperation in order for a condom to work. Right. When the pill comes along, it gives women the ability to determine when and how often they're going to have kids. And then we see this in the data. It contributes to a real significant shift. There's a lot of interesting research that uses variation. So states allowed the pill at different times. And you can see this really interesting variation is that states that allowed women access to the pill earlier see earlier increases in women's college attendance, women's high school completion rate, women's labor force participation, and things like that. What's really fascinating too is that you also see increases in men's education, high school completion rates, college attendance rates, right? The pill and contraceptive in general allowed people to plan those families and allowed them to look forward and say, all right, well, I'm going to get educated, I'm going to start a career, and then I'm going to have a family, right? And what's interesting is that most of this shows up just in terms of marriage age. So what happened in the middle of the 20th century is my parents' generation decided to get married later. They started getting married at the end of their 20s as opposed to the early 20s. Once they're married, they have kids at the same rate that families always did, but they just start later, right? I didn't get married to my late 20s. My parents didn't get married to their late 20s. My kids probably aren't going to get married to their late 20s. You guys probably aren't going to get married into your late 20s because you got things to do, right? And contraception allows you to make those plans, right? But what it did in practice is it shrunk family sizes, right? It got us down to 2 kids per family generally. right? And it was a big significant drop. The last part of the drop in fertility that leads to this aging population is women's labor force participation, which is tied up in the contraceptive and living standards. There's a big significant shift in the late 60s into the 70s and continuing today to achieve equality in pay, entrance of women to different careers, things that they were barred from for a long time. So that as well allows them different opportunities and reasons to, say, use the contraception to start a career in a field that they may not have been able to be in the 1920s or 30s. So all this stuff happens in the middle of the 20th century. And the argument, and well, I'll come back to the theme of what I wanted to talk about, is that this is a success, right? These are massive, massive successes. The things that drove down family size are all things that are awesome. It's relatively rich families, more access for women and families in general to contraceptive techniques, and women's ability to enter the workforce in whatever field they desire, right? None of those things, I'd argue with you, are things that you want to give up, right? And because these things contributed to, right, what do these things contribute to? They generated this figure on demographics, right? This figure comes from the fact that family sizes dropped in the middle of the 20th century. And so that's why by the 2020, we have this big bulge of old people leaving the labor force. Those things are why the worker to population ratio was really big in the 20th century, or growing really fast, and then shrunk, right? Middle of the 20th century, all these people are entering the workforce, super good for economic growth. Now what happens? They decide to have few kids. They delay their start of their families because they want to work on careers. They have the rights to and the ability to because they have access to contraception and can participate in the workforce. And that's the consequence that we're facing today. Right? Hence the reason that this growth slowdown has a lot to do with successes. Right? It's because of these things. Right? So that's the first big story about why growth slowed down, is successes in controlling family size or determining family size for people. Right? And that fed into slow labor force growth and therefore to slow economic growth today. Right? We're just dealing with decades old consequences of family decisions. So the second thing now, the second big reason for the growth slowdown, and the reason that I keep calling, second reason I'll call it a success, is that the economy shifted away from producing goods and towards producing services. Right? So this is a graph that shows you the fraction of GDP, so the share of value added. Value added is just a different way of saying GDP. The fraction of GDP accounted for by different industries. This isn't all the industries that there are, but these are four big ones. Okay? So the top dark line is manufacturing, and you can see that drop from almost a quarter of GDP to less than 15%. Right? As a fraction of our economic activity, manufacturing has been falling for decades. What's been rising? This is all fractions that have to add up to one. So what's been increasing? Healthcare, professional services, which are things like accountants, lawyers, consultants, people like that, and info and communications. So that includes, depending on exactly the year, it includes software programmers and stuff like that. Right? So we've been shifting away, like the economic activity shifted away from producing things towards producing services. And here's the issue with that for growth, is that productivity growth in the goods producing sectors or industries is higher than it is in the service producing industries. Right? Productivity growth, like how efficient we are, how much faster we get efficient. I always say this wrong. Let me start that sentence over. Productivity growth is how much more efficient we get over time. Right? And when you're producing things, that efficiency goes up really rapidly. When you're producing services, that efficiency doesn't go up as rapidly. It goes up, but not very fast. Okay. And here's the reason for that. This is by itself, I think, a really fascinating topic to think about, which is what's, in fact, that distinct difference between producing things and producing services. I think of it this way. When you produce things, when you produce a good, labor makes the product, okay? When you produce a service, labor is the product. So what do I mean by that? So imagine you buy a car, a good, okay, a thing. Well, some group of people working in a factory somewhere assembled that. They put it together. I don't know what you do to build a car. They tighten some bolts and they snap some things. Probably harder than that, but there's a bunch of people who worked on your car. It's irrelevant to you as a car driver how many people worked on your car when you're driving it. You wouldn't even know, right? Operating the car doesn't tell you about anything about how many people it took to put it together, right? I don't need those people there in order to run my car. I can go get in my car right now and drive around, and I don't even know who it was that put it together. I don't need someone to drive in from the Honda plant in Tennessee to help me drive the car, right? So for goods, labor is just like, it's important to build it, but then labor is completely out of the picture. Now think about services, okay? Services, it's essential most times that the labor is there, okay? I'm a professor, I'm a service provider, okay? And this fall is gonna be interesting because I'm not gonna be physically there, but I have to be there. I have to be like on this call. This is gonna be doing the equivalent of this kind of thing. I have to be on the call in order to give you this service, right? This talk doesn't work if I just walk into the other room. And so that makes it really hard to improve productivity. For goods, if Honda figured out a way to make the car I drive with half the people, I wouldn't care. If it meant that the car was cheaper, I'd like that. If it meant that the car had more features, I'd like that, but I wouldn't know. Right? Whereas if I tried to have the amount of labor I put into this, like if I told you right now, I'm like, yeah, that was it, I'm done, right? I told you guys I'd talk for an hour, but basically I'm out of here. I just did it, I spoke twice as fast and now I'm gone. Well, you guys would be mad, right? That you were asking for my time and I didn't give it to you. The classic example of this is that think about music, right? What's the productivity of producing live music? It hasn't improved at all in a couple thousand years. Right? So the guy who originally was writing about this used to talk about, and I can't ever remember the name of the piece. So let's all pretend that I'm really smart and remember the name of some Mozart string quartet, right? So when Mozart writes this 400 years ago, it took those 4 people, say 15 minutes to play that string quartet. If you go see 4 people play that same string quartet today, how long does it take them? It takes them 15 minutes. And if they played it faster than that, you'd be pissed. You're like, what the heck? Why did you double the speed of this piece, right? So productivity growth in music production is essentially 0. Right? That's the difference between goods and services. What consequence does that have for us? It just means that as we shift away from producing goods and towards producing services, we kind of naturally are shifting into a world in where we have slow productivity growth. We do things, services, that are hard to make more efficient. It's just a little harder to make it more efficient when mainly what we produce is services. And so that's the second big story about why growth slowed down. That's part of that productivity growth term. Now, before we talk about whether that's good or bad and why I'm going to argue that's a success, let's be really clear. When I say that we've shifted away from producing goods and towards services as a fraction of economic activity, that doesn't mean that we produce fewer things. Okay? This is a graph showing you just indexed how much real output there is from those same 4 sectors, right? So you remember manufacturing as a share was falling. But manufacturing, the dark line here again, we still produce more stuff than we used to, right? We still produce more manufactured goods in the United States than we did in 1970, right? But that dark line at the bottom here, this one, doesn't go up nearly as fast as the dashed line for professional services or as this dotted or whatever line this is for info and communications, right? Manufacturing shrunk as a fraction of economic activity because it didn't grow as fast as the things that were growing quickly, like software and professional services. Right? Which gets us to the reason why this shift into services is a success, why I'll argue it's a success. It's a success because We have tons of crap, right? We got lots of stuff. Manufacturing's really, really good at what it does, okay? Cars have a ridiculous amount of features relative to what they did when I was a kid. That's one way we see the increased amount of goods that we have available. The other way is that most things are ridiculously cheap. Okay, it's a great, and I can't think of the number off the top of my head. One way of thinking about this is thinking about like how long you had to work in order to afford certain material goods. So if you go back far enough in time, okay, you could spend 2 to 3 weeks of your working life just to earn enough money to buy a shirt, right? So this is in the 1800s. Buying a shirt was non-trivial. Clothes were really expensive because they were labor intense. We weren't very good at producing them. The raw materials were expensive. And now you could probably afford a t-shirt in the space of working for about 10 or 15 minutes at the median wage in the US. Right? Clothes are ridiculously cheap. Food is ridiculously cheap in the US. Like, it's a fraction of your family's budget in a way that your grandparents would be stunned, right? Families used to spend 40 to 50 to 60%, and this is in the 1920s and 30s, upwards of around half of their entire budget, half of their entire income they'd spend on food. I would guess most American families spend somewhere under 10%. That's maybe 15% if you count eating out. Food's cheap, right? The reason we shift into services is because we're so good at producing stuff that we go buy other things, right? That's a success. We're in this position where we produce a lot of services, and we can produce a lot of services for each other because we just don't need that many people anymore producing goods, right? And again, that's a success. That's the material success we've had. And another reason why I'd tell you that if you wanted the growth rate to go up, well, would you give up all the stuff? Okay. There's really a classic example of this happening, and you can see really high growth. So if you go look at economic history, you can look back and find a couple examples of countries that grow super fast. Japan and Germany, really rapid growth rates in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Two of the fastest growing economy, the Chinas of their day. Okay, why did they grow so fast? Because we had bombed the crap out of them in World War II, and there was essentially nothing there, right? It's easy to grow quickly when you're poor. Not easy. There's a lot of poor countries that can't figure it out. It's relatively easy to grow fast when you're poor. Okay? Think of it as an example of like being a kid, right? When my daughters were born, they grew really fast, way faster than me. Okay, they got much, much taller in the first couple of years of life. Their growth rate was really high. Why? Because they were babies, right? They were really short. They had much higher growth rates than I did. I haven't gotten taller in decades, right? But I was much taller. We're at the tall stage, right? As an economy, we're at the success of being, and that's part of the reason the book that I wrote is called Fully Grown. It's like, we're at the tall stage. We're not growing anymore as much, because it would be weird if we were growing that fast. If my daughters continue to grow as fast as they did as infants, it would be a medical problem, in fact, right? So we got to think about where we are in this kind of like growth range of economies, and we're at the upper end. We're rich, so we grow relatively slow. All right, so two big successes: the demographics and the material living standards that shifted us into services are the two big successes that are behind slow growth today, right? Now, there's lots of reasons to think about other sources for slow growth. And I'll admit fully, when I went into this project, I was convinced that it had to do with a lot of these things, okay? That it had to be other things that were making us grow more slowly. Market power, mobility, government, inequality, trade. All these things must be what's going wrong, okay? But let's think about some of these. So I'm going to kind of blow through these so we can do some more questions in some sense rather than just me yapping. But so market power. So this question of, are industries more concentrated? Are markets more tied up with monopolies or just a few firms running everything? That comes from a lot of this evidence that economic profits have been rising over the last 30, 40 years, okay, and capital costs have been flat. There's some interesting stuff to play with, that maybe economic profits were in fact higher in the 1950s. But this increase here from 80 to 2016 has been speculated about as saying, oh, this is why growth is slow. Essentially, we've got more monopolies, and monopolies, if you did take an econ class and paid a little bit of attention, we always will tell you, are really inefficient. They underproduce, right? They try and jack up the price and they limit the quantity. And that's true. The problem is that you just can't get it to account for a lot of the growth slowdown. Yes, growth slowed down when market power and economic profits increased. And that shows up as well in slower entry rates and exit rates of businesses. So there's just less turnover, right? Like why try and enter why start a new small business if Walmart's in your town? That's the idea of this figure, is that entry and exit rates have gone down. The problem is that it just doesn't account for much, because yes, market power going up leads to less reallocation, fewer new firms, but it also means that we're shifting towards higher value products, right? Apple has a huge markup on its products, okay? And it's close to a monopolist. It's at least got a huge brand value, right? But those are high value products, and I can tell you that because we keep buying them. Right? So it's not obvious actually that that's part of the growth slowdown. Us buying more and more expensive products indicates that, okay, that we value those things. So market power can't quite account for the growth slowdown the way that demographics and the shift to services can. Another option is that there's lower mobility, right? So this graph gives you an idea of how city populations and GDP per capita in those cities are related, and it's big positive. So here's New York out here, biggest city, also really highly productive. San Jose, Silicon Valley is pretty big, very productive. San Fran, Seattle, LA. And then you got small cities over here which just aren't very productive. Why would this matter for the growth slowdown? Well, you may have heard people speculate a lot about the fact that people don't move as much as they used to. People used to move a lot. People used to go from these small cities and move into large cities. And that doesn't seem to happen. That's too bad in some sense from the economic growth perspective, because if they went from here with low productivity to New York and LA and San Fran with high productivity, that might boost overall output, right? By not moving as much, we're sacrificing some of that. Okay. That could be part of the reason for the growth slowdown, but if it is, it's probably a small reason. Government, taxes, regulations, you can look all you want at the data, but they don't line up with the slowdown. The timing doesn't work. The growth slowdown starts around the year 2000, which is exactly the time during the George W. Bush's presidency that taxes were lowered substantially twice, including dividend taxes, which were supposed to boost investment and economic growth, and we see nothing, right? There's just no effect. If you look across states, at states with tighter regulations, New York, Massachusetts, California, Washington, those places grow just as fast and are just as rich as states with very loose regulations, like Texas and Utah. And there just isn't a huge relationship. So it's not clear that government policy immediately and directly created the growth slowdown. I forgot I had this chart in here. So this is just to give you a little bit of that evidence. So along the x-axis are the ranks of states and how kind of open they are or how unregulated they are. So number 1 is Utah, the least regulated, and out here is New York, the most regulated. And you can see that the average growth rate of GDP is essentially the same no matter what your ranking is. If anything, growth might be slower for the least regulated places. So it doesn't appear that regulation and taxation are really responsible for the growth slowdown. Okay. Inequality, it's in the data, it's hard to link inequality to slow growth. It doesn't show up directly as affecting productivity, and it doesn't show up real directly as affecting human capital accumulation. So it can be an issue for other reasons, but the growth slowdown isn't one of them. And then the last one that's often thrown out there is trade, particularly trade with China. And trade with China has devastated certain communities and certain industries, but they're not big enough to explain why overall growth has fallen by so much. All right. This just gives you a little summary of where all this stuff kind of added up. I threw a bunch of things out there, but this is the summary table that gives you the best idea. Here was the growth rate in the 20th century, about 2.25%. The successes that I argued for, the smaller family sizes, increased access to contraception, female labor force participation, that subtracted about 0.8 percentage points from the growth rate by itself. The shift to services, probably about another 0.2. So we can get 1 percentage point off the growth rate just from those two things that were big successes. What about these, quote, failures? These other things I talked about? The reallocation or the lack of reallocation of people between, say, cities and states, that might shave off another 0.15 percentage points. The market power might shave off the 0.15 percentage points, and the lack of people moving back and forth might shave off another 0.1, but those compared to the successes aren't very big. And then the taxation and regulation and inequality and trade with China, just about zero. They just don't contribute much. So you can get from the 2.25 down to the 1% growth rate we've had recently, mainly as a consequence of successes. So I can go back and ask again, is like, well, what would you do to reverse this, right? What would you give up in order to get the growth rate back up to 2.25%? And you'd have to give up the demographic changes. We'd have to start having massive family sizes, right? Everybody out there would have to start having 4 and 5 kids. Even if you did, it'd still be decades before those kids hit the labor force and actually boosted the growth rate. And in order to get people to have 4 and 5 kids, what are you going to do? Are you going to tell people they have to get married at 20, which is about the only way you can manage to kick out 4 or 5 kids healthily? Or are you going to tell, well, why don't we just cut off access to contraception? Why don't we insist that women leave the labor force, things like that? I don't think we're going to give that up or want to give that up. Are you going to try and raise growth by shifting back into producing goods? That'd be awesome. Well, an easy way to do that would be to say, I don't know, just destroy half the houses in America. The construction industry would go crazy, right? That'd be super great for growth. It'd be really bad for our living standard. Okay. There isn't much reason that we give up in order to change the growth rate. Okay. Which, I don't want to put this. Yeah, let me do that now. Which means that we've got this opportunity to think about things other than the growth rate. Okay. For a long time, we've been hyper-focused on the growth rate as like our measure of economic success. Is the growth rate high? If it is, that means we're doing well, and that's pretty much all we're going to talk about. But the growth rate's falling, and it's falling on its own for all these reasons that have to do with successes. And those things aren't going to change, right? Our preferences have pushed us towards smaller families and into consuming services. So those things, like, unless we make these kind of crazy sacrifices that seem ridiculous, those things aren't going to go away. So the growth rate's going to be slow, in some sense, no matter what we do. So that starts to tell us, okay, well then, who cares about the growth rate? Which is a weird thing for a guy who studies economic growth to say, but who cares about the growth rate? The slow growth being an outcome of success tells us that we've got opportunities to address other economic issues without worrying so much whether growth is high or low. We can address inequality. We can address the level of regulation or the kind of regulation. We could address the effects of trade. We could address whether there's full employment or not. We could address whether people have health insurance or not. We could address the ability of people to retire or not. We could address all those things because we've reached this kind of plateau of success, which puts us in the position to deal with those things without having to freak out that the growth rate is going to go down. It already has. It's already has because of the choices we've made. So we can stop obsessing about it and start focusing on other issues that may be of more relevance, right? So in some sense, the growth slowdown, oddly, is something you can look at with some sense of optimism, because it means that we've reached the stage where we can start pushing buttons on other issues, right? That it's okay to think hard about how do you achieve universal healthcare, how do you achieve, kind of higher minimum living standards for the worst off in society and not freak out about the growth rate. And in fact, can push back on people that insist that those things may be hard to do because of their effect on the growth rate by using some of this kind of evidence to say, no, but the growth rate's low for other reasons. And doesn't have to do with how we distribute or share in the consequences of growth. It has to do with, the economic growth has to do with a bunch of preference choices we made decades ago. So if I tell you about what's going to happen in the future, people always want to ask me, like, so what's the growth rate? I give this talk or I talk about this subject with groups that include lots of businessmen and finance guys, and they always want to forecast for what growth is going to be. It's going to be slow. It's going to be like 1% per year for the next 2 decades for sure, right? Technology is not going to fix this. We're not going to invent something that really flips this around. I could be wrong about that. Maybe AI or something. Maybe Elon Musk will save us all, but it's doubtful. Maybe 15 to 20 years from now, after, and I hate to say this, but my mom's generation is dead. After those guys have aged out of the workforce, then we'll kind of be recalibrated to a more normal age distribution, and that drag will go away. But that's 15 to 20 years from now. They're just retiring now. But the biggest point is that it's okay. The slow growth isn't something to freak out about. We're still innovative. We still invent new things. We still have millions of ways to kind of get better at what we do without necessarily raising the growth rate. That's the book, which, I usually pitch at all those finance guys so they'll give me money. That's the main stuff I wanted to talk to you guys about. Let me, I can leave this up here in case we've got questions about some of the figures, but let the organizers maybe jump back in if they want to throw some questions at me, or I can try and jump in on the participant list and see what we got. You guys tell me. All right. You guys want me to jump? I can take a look at the chat. I see some questions floating around. You guys want me to take a look at those and just see what I got?
No, I think someone DM'd me a question.
Yeah, sure.
They asked, specifically in terms of the pandemic, what economic trends do you see happening in the aftermath and hopefully, the recovery that's going on right now?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's obviously like completely dominates the thought process on this. So the long run impact of this. So let's think past. Let's think it's 2 years from now, and then I can maybe come back and chat about what's happening in the next 2 years. But a couple of years from now, I think because we're out of this, we vaccinated ourselves. Everybody actually wears a mask when they, anyway, and we're kind of out of this mess. So I think one of the things that this may do is, and I think it has already, is started to make everybody be conscious about, wait a second, what are all the other aspects of our economy and how do I feel about them beyond just, is it growing, right? Is the stock market doing okay, right? Because it's made it incredibly clear that a certain number of people live incredibly fragile economic lives that can disappear in a heartbeat. And that maybe was easier to ignore when the churn on that was, some small percentage of people are unemployed at any given time. And maybe you don't think about that, but kind of watching it implode on a number of families all at once maybe makes more clear that there are economic issues we want to address outside of the growth rate, right? That maybe there's things about the safety net or the healthcare system or or what have you that we should be more conscious of. So I think in that optimism, you tell I tend to be like, well, what's maybe the best thing we can get out of this kind of attitude, which is that maybe it kind of gets everybody to think harder about this stuff immediately and maybe sooner than we otherwise would. And I think it also maybe helps illustrate the point that maybe what's less important is whether the growth rate is 2% or 1.5 or 1, but how about we just make sure people don't die because there's a disease floating around? Or how do we get all the communities in this country to be able to kind of subsist economically such that they don't feel like their lives are going to disintegrate the moment one bad shock happens, right? So maybe it's made us think a little harder about that, and that maybe we'll be able to start addressing those things sooner. What's going to happen in the next 2 years? It's a great question. I don't know. If I knew, I'd probably be a lot richer than I am right now. I mean, what we're in the middle of right now is, I lived through the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and that was a lifetime defining economic event for an economist. Okay. That was what we were going to write papers on and talk about for the rest of my life. This is so much more crazy and weird and scale-wise off the charts than that. So it's stunning in the depths of what's in the how everything's happening at once. Where this is like a textbook problem in some sense, right? Because it almost feels unreal. The things that we should be, the two big strong points about the current pandemic situation are nothing's going to change essentially economically until you kind of fix the virus or find a way to manage the virus, right? So you can open up and you can do anything you want, but until people feel safe, the economic consequences of this will continue. So at this point, we're still in economic triage mode. And whatever your political ideology is, there's hard to make any argument against continuing to help people for the next couple months in terms of just direct cash as best we can, because we want people to stay home so that they don't keep, spreading stuff around. So the short run is, it's like, let's keep bailing the boat out as fast as we can. But in the long run, right, I think this has put a lot of people think hard about what kind of economy do you want when this is over. I probably over-answered that question. Got another one? And that was my dog.
There seem to be a few questions in the chat.
Yeah, let me pop that open and see. Yeah, okay. So let me kind of take a look at that. All right, so let me grab a couple of these small ones. So one of them was about how marriage is correlated to economic growth. So if you think about so there's kind of two ways that marriage, so think about family structure in general related to the economic growth. So think about two things. There's people are making a decision about, say, when to get married, and then when they're married, how many kids to have, right? And so economic growth can matter for both of those decisions. In particular, it may matter for when you get married. That seems to be the real decision point for most people. If the economy looks like it's growing pretty quickly, and you're, I can find a job, I can get a job in this industry that I really like, I'm building a career. Very often, people are like, well, let me push marriage backwards. Let me get married later, right? Because I want to establish myself professionally, that kind of thing. And we see this in lots of different contexts across lots of countries. And so the conditions of the economy are related to age of marriage and if people get married and when they get married. If you go backwards enough in time, when everybody kind of lived on a farm, there was kind of no reason not to get married. And in fact, you might want to get married because it was risky to not be married, right? You want to have a link with other families that you might be able to share risks with. Whereas when the economy gets richer and richer and richer, you're less worried about those one-off risks, like, oh God, what happens if the corn goes bad? That becomes less relevant to you, and you can maybe take advantage of that to delay marriage, delay starting a family. Or if you look at it from the other perspective, you may look at it as, oh my God, I can't start a family because I need a house and I need these, and it needs to be a house in a good school district, and it needs to be this and it needs to be that, and I have to have the minivan, and I have to be able to take them to soccer practice and buy them a violin and all these things. And so it may be that economic growth maybe is not freeing you to start your family later. Maybe it's making you feel compelled to start it later because you feel the need to have a certain amount of material goods to support that family. But there's very clearly in the data a strong connection of marriage age and economic levels of economic development. And those marriage ages are super correlated to how many kids you have. The later you get married, it's just hard to have a lot of kids if you get married at 30, just physically. Not impossible, and people do, but in general, on average kind of thing, as people get married later, they have fewer kids. I hope that got towards the answer people were looking for. Virtual work affecting work hours. So that was back here on some of the numbers where that work hours have been falling for decades, since the 1800s, since the early 1900s, they've been falling. And I think it's a great question because I don't think it's obvious. This is a great economics question because there's not a clear answer. Virtual work, will it make working hours fall? It could. I'd argue that it makes the actual work hours fall. As someone who has worked from home before in different contexts, I can get way more done at home in a couple hours than I can sitting in an office for 8 hours. So I think in practice, work hours may shrink because people find themselves very productive in the 4 or 5 hours that they spend time working at home. Okay? So it could be very possible that everybody starts working 4 or 5 hours a day or 25 hours a week or something like that. Once they realize, like, hey, this is pretty great. I don't have to go into work and all this stuff. The opposite would be that it makes working hours go up because people feel that they're connected, and your boss and other companies or clients and things essentially don't have this limit of thinking that you're only available when you're in an office. And so maybe it makes us all more available and hence allows us to work more. I think it's my own personal feel is that the fewer working hours things will win out, because I think as people self-manage at home, they're able to be a little more efficient in that time. But it's a great question, and I'm not sure exactly what the outcome would be. All right, moving down. There's a whole back and forth about shirts. Shirts were really expensive in the 18th century. That's the quick answer to that. They're very cheap now. Right? So you were working weeks of your life to afford one shirt in the 18th century. Now you're working, a couple hours. So there's a question about taxes. A couple questions about taxes. And how it changed from the 20th century to now, and then more in general, like how tax rates vary, say, between Vermont and California, or between New York and other states. There's absolutely, so let's think about just the long run change in tax rates for the US as a whole. Tax rates today are lower than they have been throughout much of the 20th century. So the 20th century compared to the last 20 years was much more highly taxed. So at the end of the 1930s, the top marginal tax rate was in the 90s. It was in the 90 some percent. And it affected one guy. This is a fascinating story. It affected one guy, John Rockefeller, the guy who had owned Standard Oil and before it broke up. He was the richest guy in the United States, and so he had his own tax rate of 90% on his income. And throughout the middle of the 20th century, top marginal tax rates were 50, 60, 70%. So if you know how tax rates work, that's not on every dollar you earn, that's just on the top dollars that you earn. So you had to be pretty rich to pay those rates. But they were quite high. They dropped in the 80s, they dropped again a little in the 90s, they went up a little in the 90s, and then they dropped substantially in the early 2000s, and again a couple years ago, early in this administration. So we live in a very low tax regime for the United States in terms of its history. Across states, there's big variation, as you guys know, and are asking about variation in state tax rates. And city tax rates. So, New York City has its own income tax rate, and a lot of big cities do that as well. So there's tons of variation. But what's interesting is that isn't really related to where economic activity takes place, and it isn't really related to economic growth, from what we can tell. New York remains big and really rich and super productive per person, way richer and more productive than, say, Utah. Which has very low tax rates. Why is that? A lot of that has to do with scale. New York's huge. If you're going to start a business, you might think about a couple things. You're like, well, one, do I have a good idea that no one else has done before? Okay, great. So let's say you have the idea. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, where should I start my business? I could start it in Salt Lake City with really low taxes, or I could start it in New York. All right. Well, it'd be great to pay low taxes, so maybe I should go to Salt Lake City. Problem with Salt Lake City is there's only like 1 million people there. So even if you have this really great idea, I don't know what you're selling, whatever, but your market is only about 1 million people. If you move to New York City, the greater New York area, it's 18, 20, 25 million. Your market is 25 times bigger. And within range is, Southwest Connecticut and New Jersey and all this stuff. You've probably got 30 to 40 million people available as customers in a range that would be similar to Salt Lake City's. So the tax rates, part of the reason they maybe don't line up or don't have such a clear effect on economic growth or business activity is that taxes are low in places that are small and taxes tend to be high in places that are big. And it may be as crude as that, but I think that may be it. All right. What else do I got in the chat? Oh, we're back on shirts. Let me hold on the shirts for a moment. Unemployment benefits, decreasing the productivity of workers. So this is one of these things where the pandemic is terrible, but also from an economist perspective is fascinating because it's like a big experiment in how people react to these things. Unemployment benefits in general, theoretically in econ, for sure, we think they have effects on employment, right? If you made them generous enough, and you kind of do the thought experiment, if you made unemployment benefits enough, generous enough, people wouldn't want to work. Right? So if they were $10,000 a week, you'd be like, oh, I'd much rather be on unemployment insurance than have a regular job. But it's not clear where the tipping point is, right? Like it's not clear that, say, $600 a week, in fact, makes people want to just hang out on unemployment insurance as opposed to work. People generate a lot of, we're seeing this the last couple months. People get bored really fast. And people have actually, in all these contexts we find in the research, are really unresponsive to benefits and taxation. People work. The vast majority of people work. Yes, everybody has a cousin who is like a deadbeat, who's like, oh, I totally am just going to, sign up for disability if I can and fake an injury and try and get out of stuff. But everybody's got one just cousin like that, not everybody. Okay. So we don't see a lot of effect of the level of unemployment benefits on work participation. In this context with the pandemic, it's hard to say how that research would apply because this is totally unique. And in this situation, in some sense, you want the unemployment benefit to be super high because you want people to stay home. I don't want them to go work at the bar that opened up because the governor is an idiot. I want them to stay home. So this is a weird scenario for that. But in general, we don't see huge effects of the level of unemployment benefits on work. Part of the reason is that you can collect unemployment benefits for a very limited amount of time. Most states, you can get them for a max of 26 weeks, so half a year after you've been unemployed, and only in conditions where you were fired under very specific rules. So if you're a waiter in most states and you get fired, you're not eligible for unemployment insurance. If you quit your job, you're not eligible for unemployment insurance. It's very limited the amount of people that actually are able to access this. This current pandemic being a massive historical weird thing where a bunch of people got fired all at once, that has never happened before. So, so in that sense, the unemployment benefits don't change workforce participation, and they don't change the productivity of workers. That's really a function of their human capital and the physical capital they work with and stuff like that. All right, what else do I got here? Oh, let me come back to the shirts, okay? So there's some other questions about whether it's, yeah, go ahead.
Professor Vollrath?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yep.
So I think we could just one more question.
Oh, yeah.
Posed to me.
I like to yap, so.
So I think a few days ago, the market capitalization value for Amazon went through the roof, and billionaires like Jeff Bezos and so on are experiencing massive gains in wealth, which is strange to notice, in a pandemic. So do you think just in general is working for the economy? Are they kind of stability?
So I'm losing you on the audio a little, Joel, but I think, so kind of nod or just let me know if I'm getting this right. So you're asking about, like, so we know Bezos is making, I don't know, crap tons of money on the value of Amazon during this pandemic, right? And I think what you're asking is this, quote, good or bad for the economy, right? So let me see here's the thing. It's really good that we have Amazon during this, right? This would have been a lot harder 15 or 20 years ago to deal with if you didn't have on-demand delivery of everything. So in that sense, the guy who, owns the big chunk of it, kind of that sense, you kind of want people to benefit for ideas like Amazon. You want someone to get rich off this in that sense, because that's ultimately what kind of got Bezos into the business in the first place. Now, I'm not saying he predicted the pandemic and planned it or anything. I mean, it's not like a conspiracy theory, but we want innovators and entrepreneurs to benefit from their ideas so that people continue to want to produce things like Amazon. At the same time, you can have a totally fair discussion about, but what about the scale of the benefits from this, right? Are those disproportionate to the value of what he does? So think about it again. So I use the example of starting a business in Salt Lake versus New York City. How much credit should Jeff Bezos get for opening Amazon in the US, which is a huge market, right? So he had a great idea, which is to use the internet to sell things cheaply and deliver them quickly. And he expanded from books, and it's a really brilliant business model, and we all benefit from it. So he deserves, in that sense, you would usually argue, he deserves to make some profits off of this. But part of his profits, right, the scope of the money he's making, is because the U.S. is a huge market, right? Without the U.S. being this big, he wouldn't earn that much money, right? If he ran Amazon on a tiny Pacific island with 10,000 people, and that was the limit of his market, he wouldn't be making he wouldn't be worth billions of dollars. He'd be worth hundreds, thousands. So the argument or the discussion we can have about this is really how much of Bezos's wealth is because he gets to live in the US, or he's been able to create it in our giant market, which we all essentially generate, versus how much of it is quote his, how much is it his idea. And it's not obvious what the answer to that question is, right? We know we want him to profit to some extent, because we want new entrepreneurs in the future to essentially try and replace Amazon. I want the next guy with a better idea than Amazon to come along and say, I'm going to take out Amazon and I'm going to do it better. And he's going to do that because they're going to make a lot of money. Okay. But they're also going to do that because they happen to be operating in this giant country with a huge market. And that giant country with a huge market is our contribution to those profits. So it's a fair argument to have about, well, how much is too much, essentially, right? And then I think that gets to this question of, it gets to a question of corporate profits and things like that across the board. You know, how much of the money that a company makes is because of their good idea, and how much is because they operate within the US and have hundreds of millions of people and a large, rich economy with a, you know, generally functioning, you know, society. How much of that should we essentially be able to grab the benefits of versus the guy who owns the company?
Thank you all. I guess it's been very invaluable to hear your insight, Professor Vollrath. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for coming to this webinar. Just keep an eye on future events on our social medias, which we'll be posting about. Later on, we will send you a link to Professor Vollrath's blog if you're interested. So yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thanks for having me, guys. I hope listening to me babble for that long wasn't too awful. All right, have a great day, guys.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your webinar. Thank you.
Just happened.
No.
So can we end the recording, please?
Oh yes, let me stop recording.